the button of record.
Thank you so much, Károly. This was such a wonderful introduction, and thank you for having me. I was delighted to receive the invitation and to know that I have now about an hour to talk to you about some of the things we've done in the past couple of years in my lab. This is an exciting topic for me, close to my heart. As you alluded to, I have a background in science, but then I also have a background in media, and I'm interested in how the two come together to make our world even more complicated and even more complex. So what we'll do today, I'm going to present to you a talk on how networks bias academic communication online. We are going to look at how science is shared on the web and how science has changed over the past couple of years in reaction to some of the new technologies that we are engaging with on probably daily basis today. So I'll start out by bringing to your attention a seminal paper from almost 30 years ago. Funtovits and Ravet wrote in Futures a long time ago how science has potentially reached a new era. They were contrasting normal science, the old way of doing science, which was curiosity-driven, very productive, with the new ways of doing science that have to tackle real-world problems. They were thinking about already back then about sustainability issues, issues related to the environment that had potentially big risks attached to them and that had to engage with new solutions. And this research has come up now in the wake of the pandemic, and people are discussing now this idea of post-normal science. And just to give you a sense, I'm not going to be too theoretical here, they refer to post-normal science as the sort of science that tries to tackle problems when facts are uncertain, when most of the values are in dispute, and the stakes are high. So these all apply to COVID-related situations. I'm sure all of you can connect to this, when decisions were urgent, decisions had a high impact, and yet we had a lot of uncertain facts. This original work and then all the papers that came out in 2020 and maybe since then, thinking about how science has to change its way of reacting to the world, highlight the importance of not just scientific communities, but extended peer communities. So how do we connect with audiences beyond our colleagues and beyond our narrow scientific communities? How can we democratize science? There were a lot of questions related to social justice, racial justice, and I think this brings to the forefront questions of diversity in science production. And then also, how do we ensure that science has the best quality? And these are all questions that resonate with me very well since even before the pandemic, we have been trying to tackle precisely these questions. So first, we recognize that researchers use some type of social media for the dissemination of their work. Audiences engage with scientific content on online platforms. This has been increasing every year in the past decade. And then journalists are also readily using social media to understand public opinion and to share their writing. So I felt that the terrain was there for better understanding how science reaches the public, how scientists talk about their work, how journalists try to make sense of this. So there is this increased information out there about science that is currently still, I would say, understudied, despite the many pieces that we have written on the topic. So let me tell you a little bit more about my approach. So the overarching question of the past few years research agenda was whether the networks that we see about the spread of scientific articles, scientific advances in online spaces, can they be used to improve science communication for researchers, but then also for society at large. So the one thing that I'd like to point out about this big question and about the mission of what we are doing is that it is, of course, ingrained in Science of Science. I know you've had Science of Science speakers and even this semester, and this is a very important domain area of study where we are trying to understand, we are becoming very meta and trying to understand how data science could help us improve the way we conduct innovation in science. But then also it is, in my view, a little bit narrowly scoped because it has this very narrow focus on scientists and improving their work. And I think a complementary view that my work is engaging with increasingly is how do we go beyond the scholars? How do we try to understand what's going on beyond that? So audiences outside of academia. And I'm involved with civic science initiative at the Rita Allen Foundation, and I think that there, but also outside of that philanthropic institution, there are many incentives and many initiatives to try and connect better audiences with science and get some grassroots efforts going in relation to science. So that's super exciting. I'll talk about that towards the end of the talk. So with this broad setting, so having an understanding for how science has changed recently and the new demands for how we would like to see science being conducted, I propose to go over these research questions, and I will not go into details. I know this looks like a lot, even in a Zoom room. But I'm happy to offer details. Feel free to interrupt me if you have questions. I will focus mostly on the takeaways, some of the more interesting findings that might apply to your work as well. So the way we are going to do this, we are going to talk a little bit about how scientific articles are spreading online. I think we are the first ones to model the multi-platform spreading of articles. So in the diffusion literature, something that information scientists have looked at quite a bit, most studies focus on one platform or maybe two. We are proposing to look at this phenomenon at the multi-platform scale, so including various types of sources or information sources where people engage with science. Besides that, we are also interested in looking at how information is retained in these platforms. In particular, when it comes to science, we are very concerned about misinformation, and one way of getting to a misinformed public is by sharing science in a way that does not retain key pieces of information. So we'll talk about that a little bit. Then we'll look at how biases are shaping or what biases arise in the sharing of science. In particular, I'm highlighting here gender biases. Those are the ones that we've looked at in most detail, but we'll talk a little bit about ethnic biases as well. And then finally, we will look at this question of quality control slash misinformation in science. In particular, we are going to go after retracted papers in quotes. What we'll do is to try to see how retracted research shows up on social media, in the news, and so on. So on various platforms, we're going to see what audiences are engaging with it, who's sharing retracted work, and how are those sharing patterns different from articles that have not been retracted, just to understand what's particular about the reception and the attention given to retracted work. I'll have some sobering findings here, but there will be obviously a lot of exciting findings that hopefully can help us think about ways to intervene in a positive way. So this is what I proposed for today. Let me know if there are any questions. Again, it's so hard to read a Zoom room, so raise your hands or just jump in right away. And so I'll start with the first question space, how are scientific articles spreading online? And the first thing that I'll do is introduce our very valued data source. I have a partnership with Altmetric in doing this work. We have from them comprehensive data on what we call sharing trajectories. So you see on the left side of the screen, one example paper that is being tracked by Altmetric. You see that they have quite a bit of metadata about papers. And then most importantly, they have the data that enables us to create these time series, these trajectories for how research, how those specific papers are shared on different platforms. What I'm showing you here is just the instance of the mentions. On the x-axis, you have time. So days since the first mention of a paper, and you have 4 platforms as illustration on the y-axis. And we have such data for almost 10 years, so the past decade essentially. The data covers all disciplines and publication venues. We have a bunch of users who are engaged in sharing these papers, and then a bunch of mentions. And so from this data, what we are trying to do, given this unique component where we can see how the research is shared on various platforms, we are trying to get an understanding for this multi-platform diffusion. And the reason this is important is because on the one hand, prior research that I'm trying to illustrate with this prior research matrix, the research has focused mostly on single platforms. That's why you see examples on the diagonal. And a few papers have looked at maybe 2 platforms. Some of my favorites are the paper by Liskovich et al. And Tan et al. But I think if we have an application-driven question, we want to understand how science is shared online, then we have to look at multiple platforms. And one of the reasons we find this super important is because there are many digital inequalities in people's presence on some of these online platforms. So if you look at Facebook, you will have a substantially different demographic than if you look at Reddit, for instance. So we want to make sure that we cover all those audiences, and that we also are aware that people use media repertoires. This is just a literature-based word to say that people use multiple platforms at the same time, and they use them differently for different purposes. So this is just an argument from the literature to highlight how we want to make sure that our methods engage with the variety of platforms. And this is not easy, obviously, because these platforms are very differently structured, and that has implications for, say, information retention, as we'll see. So the first thing that I'll mention is our result related to how sharing science is similar in many ways to sharing other types of content online, like news articles, memes, photos, videos, and such. And the one finding that I selected for today's talk is related to the burstiness of science-related information. So you'll see this example on Twitter. There was a burst. So a burst, just colloquially, will mean an increased attention, a spike in this time series. So you see that there was increased attention right after publication. There were a bunch of mentions there. But what you also see is that there are later bursts denoted by the stars on this graphic. And this is a positive message to me, at least. It means that bursts recur. So even if theoretically, even if your paper didn't get a lot of attention at the very beginning, it might have a resurgence of attention later on. So there might be some interesting attention to it online. Now, going beyond trying to understand in the many ways in which science is shared, just like any other content, we try to go from the time series of mentions, these trajectories shown on the lower part of the slide. So the information about who posted what, when, and on which platform, we try to extract from that how the network, the influence network, might have looked like. So who got the information about science from whom. So who posted in reaction to whose post, and that's what you see in the middle of the graphic. This is just a conceptual graphic. I'll again talk more about the method to infer this network, but in a nutshell, what it does, it applies a heuristic to say that if two users consistently mention science one after the other, the direction being in favor of one person, then we assume that there is a link where that person gets their information about science from the other person. It's an imperfect heuristic, but we find with various methods that this is probably the most informative yet simplest way to understand how this network might have looked like. And so based on this inferred network, one of the questions that we are asking is, how does virality, so the ability of a piece of paper or a piece of content, a science paper, to spread broadly in this network, so how does this virality change based on whether the paper was shared by an organization versus as an individual? And how does it change depending on what platform it started in? So whether it was posted first in the news as opposed to Twitter. And on the left side, I'm showing you the first result already. So what you see here on the x-axis is this Wiener index, which is the notion of structural virality. It starts at the low Wiener index, so that was a small tree. It goes to a higher value, which indicates, just like in the shown circle depiction, a more viral spreading of content. And what you see here is that individuals are likely to produce lower structural virality content than organizations. So a piece of advice, whenever you can, you have a paper coming out, it might be worth getting your institution, your organization to talk about it first. To highlight the importance of traditional media, even in these new platforms, on the right side, I'm showing you now the same quantity on the x-axis, structural virality. The platform of initial post is shown on the y-axis, and then the data itself shows how structurally viral were trajectories or time series that got started on Twitter, news, Facebook, and so on. And you see that the highest expected structural virality is on the news. So this is yet another nudge to, whenever possible, have a press release related to your article, because that gives you the highest expected virality, the highest expected visibility in these online spaces. So after we unpack these temporal components of sharing science online, we were asking ourselves, okay, so that's nice. We know that there's some burstiness. We know that certain conditions facilitate virality or are associated with higher virality, but how about content? We are very preoccupied with this idea of information retention versus information loss as a first step to understand how information, in particular about science, is distorted online. And a key piece of prior work conducted by an amazing team back in 2019 was an experiment that essentially looked at how people perceived information retention in relation to abstracts of research papers. And what they found was that as soon as people retained keywords from the abstract, they felt or they perceived that the facts of the abstract, the science, were retained heavily. So this inspired us to develop a computational measure of information retention that we then use to try to understand, to go beyond this experiment and try to understand how information retention looks like in the wild, so on these various platforms. To give you a little bit more context about the measure, we extracted keywords from abstracts and from posts using state-of-the-art or a standard algorithm, text rank algorithm for keyword extraction. And based on this, we developed an information retention score that essentially told us, gave us a weighted understanding of which keywords from the abstract were maintained in posts, say on Twitter, on Facebook, in the news, on Wikipedia, and on blogs. Just as a side note that I want to highlight here, we validated the measure with experts, and I think this is one step that that is essential, and I don't always see it when we, I'm also a computational person, and I love to come up with scores, measures that let us quantify things at scale. But I think it's essential that we validate these measures with human experts or with subjects who have important knowledge. And we did that here, and we were happy with how the measure did, in particular on the cases that were easy also for humans. So using this computational measure, we quantified how information got lost or retained when scientific articles were shared on various platforms. And the first finding is that we saw a propensity toward information loss over time. We also saw that the 5 platforms we looked at showed significant differences in information retention. As I'm showing you here on the left, blogs were the best or had the highest information retention, followed by news and then Facebook. Interestingly, these differences are not simply correlated to differences in text length. So blogs were oftentimes shorter than news, and even in some cases than Wikipedia entries. So this points to the fact that these blogs, probably by researchers, potentially by science journalists, are also very important from the perspective of information retention. And one finding that I want to highlight here that calls actually for far more work is that what we find is that article sharing trajectories that involve more platforms. So when the article was shared on Twitter, in the news, and blogs, so at least 3 platforms, that's the dark brown, then the information retention scores were typically higher than if the article would have been shared only on news or only on blogs. These are just examples. So what this suggests to us, and this absolutely calls for more work, is that multi-platform discussions of science may maintain higher fidelity information. And this could be potentially used upon further investigation to find better ways to intervene in ensuring higher information retention. So with that basic understanding of how science is shared in online spaces, both in terms of what temporal patterns arise and how content is retained, we went on to ask ourselves, are there biases in the online visibility of scholars? And the main findings will be based on gender, but I will give you an initial finding also about ethnicity, which is, I think, very interesting. So when it comes to inequalities in science, there are wide-ranging, widely documented gender inequalities. There are also some ethnicity-based inequalities. The literature that I'm showing you here points to various differences at the level of publications, revisions, citations, awards, promotion, and so on, that seems to suggest that women's research is not recognized equally to men's research. And this is a known effect that has been dubbed the Matilda effect since a seminal study from the early 90s. And this is a problem because in parallel to all these studies that highlight existing differences, we have increasingly work that shows in various contexts that gender diversity, and similar holds for ethnic diversity, have benefits in science. So female members have been shown to increase team intelligence, have been shown to decrease biases, to lead to more creative and more innovative, even higher quality work. And this is, I think, important in highlighting that we want to work on this problem. Another way to highlight the reasons we are interested in fixing gender diversity issues is that there are high societal costs for lacking gender diversity. Just to give you anecdotal examples, and there is work showing this at scale, women have been misdiagnosed with heart disease for the longest time, putting them at danger simply because the trials were devised by men, and they just didn't have an inclusive environment when it came to subjects and it came to protocols. So, and that's a big problem that I think puts this the inequality related questions very close to social justice questions. And needless to say that this is there when it comes to racial questions and ethnicity-based questions. So when we want to address the gender gap in recognition, I think it's important to recognize that biases in visibility can have substantial impacts. Counterintuitively, online scholarly communication, or these spaces on the web, have the potential to alleviate the disparities because of low entry barriers. Theoretically, everyone could be present in these spaces. However, there is a well-documented gender bias in visibility, and this is essential because it can have effects on citations, which are the de facto currency in academia, but also on awards. So we want to understand differences in visibility because they can affect many outcomes, including citations. And this is precisely what we did with the wonderful team. I like to give a shout out to Orsolya Vásárhelyi and Stasha Milojevic in particular, former student of mine, Igor, as well. And the data is to tackle this question stems also from Altmetric, except here we augmented it with historical co-authorship network data from the Open Academic Society. And information on citations and fields from the Web of Science. The gender information was not present in any of these data sets. Unfortunately, we do not have self-reported gender information. So this is probably one of the biggest shortcomings of our work and similar work done in this space, where gender is inferred from authors' first names. And it assumes that gender is binary, women, men, which is, of course, a huge simplification and something that future work should improve. So to show you a first finding, if the question is how well is female scholars' work represented online, then we see that there have been improvements over time. I'm not going to show you results over time, but in 2017 in particular, psychology crossed the 50% bar. So 52% of psychologists who gained visibility online were women. The percentages look very different for other areas. In physics, this goes down to 20%. And most importantly, if we compare this visibility, online visibility, with who is actually publishing papers, so what's the percentage of women on Web of Science, we see that the differences actually show that in comparison to Web of Science, the expectation based on Web of Science, the presence online is actually even lower. And this can be as extreme as almost 7% in chemistry. So what we deduce from this finding is that although online spaces should be welcoming and should have these very low entry barriers, many women, even fewer than who are publishing, are publicizing and promoting their work on these platforms. We also see, this will be a quick note, we also see a glass ceiling effect. So the higher you set the bar for online visibility in terms of, now we are looking at the top 25% of the scholars online, the top 15, the top 5, the top 1%. The higher you go in most areas, you see that the fewer and fewer women there are. So here on the right side, the pink bars are the expectation based on Web of Science, what percentage of the authors are women. The cross is top 25%, so that's typically lower percentage. Top 5% denoted by the circle is even lower, and so on. So we see that when we increase the bar as to how successful they ought to be in online spaces, we see fewer and fewer women represented in those categories. Now, getting to this network component that I think is essential, as literature on social capital has shown it, and on scientific impact. Networks contribute to our chances of success. I'm showing you here 4 example scientists to indicate that successful scientists, the top row, both men and women, have different networks, typically larger collaborator networks, and more intricate structures there than unsuccessful scientists, in the sense that they are below the top 25% in terms of visibility. So if we wanted to put this in a model to more systematically understand how these different factors contribute to online visibility, then what we chose to look at here, again, based on extensive literature about what factors are linked to success. As mostly a control, I will refer to a suite of variables that we grouped into the scientific impact group. So these are measures related to productivity through traditional H index, the impact factor of the journal, whether the paper is on a very popular hot topic. And then we have a suite of measures that are related to the network, the collaboration network. So how many collaborators they have, what's the density of the network, and how do a network type formation in terms of women working with men, women working with other women, and men working with men, how do those look like in the networks? And to show you the main result, the regression result, we ran here logistic regression models for different areas separately. We know that the culture in these areas is very different. The expectations and the publication norms are different. So we have different models, but in each case, what we show is the association between the variable shown on the in columns, so scientific impact, social capital, network femaleness, and so on, and its relation to online visibility. So the higher the coefficient, the higher the association between that measure of scientific impact and expected online visibility. And what you see here is that across the board, with very few exceptions, the trend for men, shown in green, is higher. The expectation of online visibility for the same levels of social capital, for instance, is higher for men than for women. Moreover, in some cases for women, these factors are not even positively or significantly associated with success. This is to say that for the same scientific impact, for instance, a female computer scientist will have potentially a negative association with online visibility, whereas for a man, this will not be significant. And you can look at this for all 4 variable groups and just see, based on this, that we have a very hard time to to give recommendation to young women in science as to what will increase their online visibility. Based on these results, we cannot say that they should work more with men or they should work more with women. And I think this points to a huge problem because we are not able to properly mentor then women and help them close that gap. This is going to be a meta slide where we from a friend we got an email about, oh, you are in the top 5% at Altmetric with your paper talking about how hard it is to get into the top 5 in terms of visibility based on Altmetric or any other platforms. So the next question after we finished this project, the next question that we had was, okay, so it seems like there are important differences in visibility. We don't know how to close these gaps. So let's step back a little bit and try to understand why they arise. Can we point to mechanisms that contribute to this difference? And the two things that came to mind were, on the one hand, self-promotion. So do women self-promote less? If they systematically do, then that might lead, of course, to lower visibility if they themselves don't promote their own work as strongly. And then the other side of the equation might be that there is still some systematic bias in sharing research. So if, say, women promoted as much as, self-promoted as much as men, but then the community, including men and women, do not share their work at the same rate, then that could also lead to differences in visibility. And I'm going to just tell you right away that we see evidence for both. I'm going to discuss here in a little bit more detail the self-promotion component. So across the board, we see that men self-promote more, 22% more often than women. This is a result for 2018, but we have data for for several years, 6 years, 2013 to 2019, and the trend is very robust. We do expect these differences, actually. There's extensive literature in psychology on the fear of backlash. So women might get more backlash when they are not conforming with existing stereotypes. There's also an important piece in terms of self-stereotyping. So many women might have heard this too much and might have internalized that they are not supposed to be doing that much self-promotion. And there's extensive literature on the imposter syndrome that also points to possibilities in terms of, to a possible difference in terms of self-promotion. So when we control for various factors, including journal impact, affiliation prestige, productivity of authors, we see that the trends in self-promotion, the gender gap in self-promotion is still there. What I'm showing you here on the left side is a plot that shows the differences in expected self-promotion for men and women when the journal factor increases. So journal impact factor increases, so more prestigious journals shown on the right mean that more women self-promote in comparison to a paper in non-prestigious journal, but then also more men self-promote, and the gap is actually in the high journal impact factor range bigger between the two groups than if we would look at low impact factor, less prestigious journals. We see that the gap is very stable when it comes to affiliation rank. So how prestigious the university is based on a suite of ranking. And interestingly, we also see a non-trivial trend in terms of the relationship between seniority and self-promotion. What this should suggest is that mid-career people, regardless of gender, mid-career people self-promote most. But this also suggests that there is a consistent gap, and mid-career, among mid-career researchers, men tend to self-promote actually more than women. Okay, I promised you a result from work in progress. When we look at two things that this prior work has not looked at, in particular at how does gender diversity relate to ethnic diversity, we find some interesting results, and we take this one step further in order to not only look at visibility online, but also include this crucial component of citation. Citations are not, I don't think they are the best measure to quantify impact in science, but they are certainly the most widely accepted ones. So that's why we are focusing on them here. So what you see here is a part of the regression table. We are again controlling for a bunch of factors that we typically control for. I'm showing you just the interesting variables. So when it comes to online visibility, then we see that online visibility is positively and significantly related to citations. So as our assumption said, the higher visibility you have with your paper in the year it came out, the more citations you are expected to get within a year. So this confirms that trend, and it does so for 7 years, ranging from 2013 to 2019, seeing that this trend in recent years is stronger than in the initial years considered in the data. We have here factors for gender diversity. We see that actually gender diversity is now more positively correlated with citations. So over the years, this trend has improved. We see that ethnic diversity started out really well in comparison to gender diversity, but that over the years, this is less and less associated with a high citation count. And then there are some interesting interaction effects here. I'm going to point you to the second to last row in this figure, where we are intersecting gender diversity and ethnic diversity to find that over the years, if teams had both high gender diversity, so more females, and high ethnic diversity, then they had a penalty in terms of citation numbers. And this is, of course, something that that I think we should take seriously, investigate more, and try to educate people about this more. One other note here on the way of quantifying ethnic diversity, we use a standard measure, but to infer ethnicity, we again rely on names. So the name origin-based ethnicity is something that we use here, and I know that that presents a suite of issues, and I'm happy to discuss that with you. Maybe you have some cool ideas for how to improve on this measure. So getting to the third part of the third and shortest part of the talk, I know we are approaching the 1 hour mark. I wanted to close this with a discussion of how potentially harmful science information is shared online. We will get to discuss here a little bit more about retractions. I'm sure all of you have heard about this. Retractions are academia's most prominent way to self-correct, to say that this paper is based on false data, or this paper did not check credible sources, or the methods were not conducted properly, or the analysis, the statistics is not correct. So there are many ways in which papers can get to the state where the community and the journals say that the paper does not present reliable findings, so we are going to retract it. I have a collaboration with the Center for Scientific Integrity. They maintain the Retraction Watch database, and just to give you a sense for how common retractions are, as a special case, as of July 2022, there were 250 COVID-19 related retracted articles. Of course, the science had to move very fast in case of COVID, so we did expect high number of retractions, but retractions are nevertheless there in other areas as well. Interestingly, prominent journals are as likely to publish retracted work as non-prominent ones, which is interesting. We'll talk about what that means in a minute. First, I'd like to point out that online attention to retracted articles is understudied. Before us, there was one team doing some work on this problem. And I will argue here that that's essential because it's one thing to communicate with a retraction to the research community that the paper is just flawed for whatever reason, but it's another thing to have that paper be disseminated in online spaces broadly and misinform publics. A prominent example there is the paper from the 90s that linked vaccines to autism, and that still has negative consequences to this day when it comes to attitudes towards vaccines, even though it's a paper that has been retracted and everyone in the scientific community knows that it's a false claim. So what we are asking here is what kind of attention is given to retracted articles, and does the retraction itself decrease the attention to these harmful papers? And this is something we reported earlier this year in a paper that you are more than welcome to look up. So here's the research pipeline. Through this collaboration with Retraction Watch, we received a large set of retracted papers, which we matched to something that we call here control papers. So we found papers that were mentioned online that came out in roughly the same year, had roughly the same number of authors, were roughly on the same topic, which we typically approximated with the journal, so in the similar journal. And we compared then these two groups, the retracted papers, how were they mentioned in online spaces, and how were non-retracted control papers mentioned in these spaces. So all the results that I'm going to present here are going to compare these groups. The first thing that I hope I will convince you of is that across the board, whether we look at social media, blogs, knowledge repositories, news media, we see that retracted papers receive more attention after publication, well before we knew that they were going to be retracted. So that's interesting. This is alarming because it says that untrustworthy research is mentioned more than expected, even on curated platforms. So including on top news, these are the most prestigious news outlets. Now, you might say that, well, that's kind of baked into being retracted because there might be many papers out there that are not never getting retracted, but actually present false results. If they don't reach a certain threshold of visibility, then nobody bothers to raise these red flags. So you might say that, well, this increased visibility might contribute to higher scrutiny, and that might lead to the retraction itself. So that's an interesting way to think about it, and that's a factor, that's a mechanism that might be at play. So in addition to this result about audiences being exposed to retracted work quite a bit more than to non-retracted work, we dug deeper to see whether on certain platforms, and we could do this reliably for Twitter, audiences mentioned Twitter in more uncertain terms, mentioned retracted work on Twitter in more uncertain terms than control papers. So this is, I think, very positive. I'm not a huge fan of social media, in particular, not when it comes to talking about science. It has not been designed to share science. It has not, it doesn't have the format to allow for thorough deliberation about science. But yet what we see is that Twitter users do systematically end up being more uncertain and more concerned about the papers that end up being retracted later. So again, this is after publication. We see that retracted papers get far more uncertainty on Twitter than control papers. Finally, with a question that has some implications for how we do retractions, potentially, we asked whether the retraction decreases the attention to harmful articles. And what we found across all these platforms was that most papers exhaust their attention by the time they get retracted. So here, the average number of mentions is very low, the error bars are very high, and an interrupted time series analysis confirms that actually there's no significant decrease in the slope of attention for retracted papers in comparison to comparing the pre-retraction and post-retraction period. So this is sad news because it does say that, at least in the online spaces we studied here, retractions did not manage to curb the online spread of problematic papers. This presents interesting questions as to how should we then do retractions? Should we, ideally, the community would be faster in issuing retractions. That's of course problematic because a retraction is a super serious action and with consequences for the researchers. So we want to make sure that we are not retracting anything that should not be retracted. So there are some important dilemmas and questions there. A last thing that I'll mention is that we looked into who is talking about retracted articles. Again, we managed to do that on Twitter only. It seems like academics talk about retracted research quite a bit, but less than they talk about non-retracted research. For the public, the trend is reversed. I think that points to a concerning piece here. So the public will be very likely to pick up on retracted work, and I'm not sure that they always know that that research ends up being declared false. Science communicators are producing trends similar to academics, and practitioners are actually more likely to be like the public in terms of talking more about retracted papers than non-retracted papers. Okay, so this is interesting. It tells us that on the web, we do see an interesting coming together of scientific audience or scientists and extended peer communities. We talked here about issues of diversity, in particular discrepancies between whose research is more visible online. I think this is essential because the role models that are shown in online spaces will shape who's going to do science down the line. And we talked about issues related to misinformation, science's quality control, showing that in science too, unsurprisingly, bad research, false findings are shared more broadly than reliable findings. And I think that presents some interesting empirical pieces of evidence that relate to this bigger question about where science is today and where we would want it to go. This is just a summary, and then I'll give a shout out to first some of the projects that we are doing, and then I'll thank the team. So we are trying to build up the infrastructure to develop computational tools for science journalists that help them better navigate the papers and the attention papers receive. These tools will be ingrained in the findings, the empirical findings that we made in this space. We are trying to develop some prediction tools that connect people's reactions. We saw some valuable signals there, in particular on Twitter. So to use those signals to see whether we can create a reliable red flagging system. And then in general, we are trying to develop ways to use the wisdom of the sharing network to act as a filter, again, mainly for science journalists. I want to thank the team. These are people without whom the work would not have been possible. Most of them are at Northwestern in my lab, but I have very valuable collaborators at the University of Michigan and at IU Bloomington. Huge thanks to them. And I want to mention that I also have a postdoc opening in my lab, so feel free to get in touch with me if you are interested in coming to live in Chicago or close to Chicago and work on these and similar problems. So thank you so much for your attention. I look forward to receiving your questions.
Thank you very much, Agnes, for this excellent talk. Yeah, maybe if there are questions, then you can raise your hand, and also probably it also would be helpful if you stop sharing your screen, and then we can see each other maybe more. And I stop recording now so that those people who are shy that also can ask